Welcome to Nocturnal Tales. Tonight we climb into the Alps, to a resort of golden stone and enormous privilege, where the very rich come not to rest, but to withdraw from the ordinary world altogether, and where in a few days' time, one of the most celebrated voices in Europe will be found dead in the snow. The Alpine Snowbound Secrets. Madame Elena Rossi is an opera singer at the height of her powers, admired, envied, and not much loved. When the mountain closes the roads and the guests find themselves sealed in together, Hercule Poirot discovers that almost everyone in that gilded hotel had a reason to wish her gone. A ruined man, a frightened doctor, a rival waiting in the wings. As always, this tale is inspired by the spirit of the great Golden Age crime writers, but the plot, the characters, and the text you are about to hear are entirely our own creation. Two quick things before we begin. Every new case reaches our inner circle on Patreon first, ad-free and ahead of everywhere else, for $2.99 a month. And if you are new to us, every story we have ever made is free to listen to at nocturnaltalespodcast.com. No paywall, no account, no password. The Patreon link is the first one in the description, and the website is just beneath it. Now, settle in as the snow closes the passes. A woman with a great many enemies takes to her rooms, and the little Belgian detective begins, very quietly, to watch the people who are watching her. Chapter 1. Nestled among the snow-capped peaks of the Alps, where the air was keen with the scent of pine, and the silence was broken only by the soft whisper of falling snow, there stood a sanctuary of extraordinary luxury. Here the privileged came to revel in seclusion, each whim anticipated within the golden walls of the resort. Yet even amid such splendor, a shadow had begun to gather. A star, though not yet fallen, was already trembling. The Alpine ski resort rose like a monument to opulence, its golden stone walls set against a backdrop of jagged, snow-draped summits. Icicles clung to the eaves, catching the last pale light of afternoon and breaking it into cold little prisms. The vast hush of the mountains lay over everything, broken only by the occasional creak of a pine bough bowing beneath its burden of snow. The air was crisp and biting, laced with frost and wood smoke. And the resort itself, with its turrets, balconies, and broad shining windows, promised warmth, elegance, and every refinement to those rich enough to claim its shelter. It was no ordinary retreat. It was a citadel of comfort for the wealthy and the celebrated, a place where one came not merely to rest, but to withdraw from the ordinary world altogether. Hercule Poirot, however, had not chosen it for its grandeur. His physician, after the conclusion of a particularly exhausting case, had been most insistent. Rest, he had declared, was no longer a luxury, but a necessity. The clear Alpine air, famed for its restorative virtues, had been prescribed as though it were medicine, and so Poirot had submitted, gracefully, though not without certain reservations. Thus it was that he stood now, having descended from the sleek motor car that had borne him up the winding mountain road. His small, precise figure was wrapped in a heavy overcoat, and his moustaches, immaculately waxed, seemed to gleam in quiet defiance of the cold. He paused a moment before the entrance, his sharp green eyes moving over the scene with quick, exacting interest. The porter's hurried gait, the silver plume of breath escaping into the air, the way the snow softened all sound into an almost unnatural hush. Behind him, George, that most dependable of valets, supervised the unloading of the luggage with his usual discreet efficiency. The cases were not many, but each had plainly been chosen with care, a mute testimony to Poirot's fastidious habits and his refusal, even in retreat, to descend into disorder. Adjusting his gloves with care, Poirot cast a critical glance about him and gave one moustache a brisk, satisfied tweak. "A fine spectacle, George. Do you not agree?" he said, his voice carrying that faint Belgian lilt, which, in moments of satisfaction, became the more noticeable. "Most striking, sir," said George steadily. "A place of rare beauty." "At least," murmured Poirot, "it has the merit of being symmetrical in its setting. Already that consoles me." They mounted the broad steps to the entrance, where they were received by Monsieur Dupont, the resort manager, a gentleman whose polished exterior suggested long experience in the delicate science of soothing the whims of wealthy patrons. His suit was immaculately tailored, his cufflinks glinted discreetly, and his smile was one which had clearly been practiced to inspire confidence. Yet Poirot, whose eye missed little, detected beneath it the faintest tremor, a shadow in the man's expression, there and gone in an instant, but quite sufficient to interest him. "Monsieur Poirot, we are honored to welcome you among us," said Dupont, extending a gloved hand. "I trust your journey was agreeable?" "Quite tolerable, merci," said Poirot courteously. "The mountains, they have a way of commanding one's attention." Dupont's smile tightened, if only by a shade. "We strive to offer our guests the utmost in comfort and discretion. Allow me to show you to your suite." They crossed the threshold into the lobby, and even Poirot, not easily impressed by displays of wealth for their own sake, paused for the briefest instant. It was a vast chamber of remarkable splendor. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead like frozen constellations, shedding light upon polished marble floors that gleamed like still water. Deep burgundy settees stood against the walls, their rich velvet making a dramatic contrast to the white world visible beyond the towering windows. At one end of the room, a great fire blazed in a hearth large enough to roast an ox, its warmth mingling with the delicate strains of a piano drifting from some unseen corner. A woman approached them with brisk and capable steps. She was introduced as Mademoiselle Clara, the head stewardess. Her uniform was faultless. Auburn hair was pinned neatly beneath her cap, and her eyes, sharp and appraising, rested upon Poirot with a flicker of intelligent curiosity. "Welcome, Monsieur Poirot. Your suite is ready, and tea will be brought to you directly." "Merci, mademoiselle," said Poirot, inclining his head. "You are most diligent." If she was flattered, she did not show it. She merely gave a small nod, and Poirot, who had a high regard for competence, approved of her at once. As they ascended the grand staircase, his attention was caught by a figure descending towards them. She was a woman of striking elegance, wrapped in a fur-trimmed coat that seemed almost to trail behind her like a cloak. Her dark hair had been arranged with exquisite care, and her face, still beautiful, still commanding, carried nevertheless the unmistakable shadow of some private burden. She paused for the briefest instant as her eyes passed over Poirot. There was, or so it seemed to him, the faintest hint of recognition in that glance before she continued on her way. "Madame Elena Rossi." Dupont lowered his voice. "The opera singer. She comes here seeking solitude before her next performance." Poirot's interest sharpened at once. Madame Rossi's name was known throughout Europe. Hers was a voice of such power and purity, they said, that it could move even the coldest heart. Yet in that fleeting glimpse he had detected something discordant beneath the perfect poise, some note of melancholy, of strain, that did not belong to the woman's public image. It was a small thing, but Poirot had built many conclusions upon things smaller still. The suite, when they reached it, proved to be a masterpiece of luxurious comfort. Wide windows framed a magnificent panorama of snow-laden peaks, the glass faintly silvered at the edges by the clash between warmth within and freezing air without. George began unpacking at once with his customary precision, while Poirot moved to the window and stood there, his hands clasped behind his back, gazing out over the twilight settling across the mountains. The whole scene was one of serene perfection. And yet he felt unmistakably that slight inward stirring which had so often preceded the arrival of trouble. It was no more than an instinct, a faint unease, difficult to name and impossible to justify. But Poirot had learned long ago not to dismiss such instincts out of hand. The snow, the silence, the luxurious stillness of the place, all seemed a trifle too complete, as though the scene had been arranged for effect and might at any moment reveal the flaw in its design. A soft knock at the door announced the return of Mademoiselle Clara. She entered bearing a silver tray upon which tea and pastries had been arranged with almost ceremonial precision. "Your tea, Monsieur Poirot. Is there anything else you require?" "Non, merci," said Poirot. Yet his eyes lingered upon her a moment longer. There was about her a certain watchfulness, a quiet alertness that suggested she saw more than she was in the habit of saying. "You have anticipated everything, mademoiselle?" She inclined her head and withdrew without superfluous speech. Poirot poured the tea for himself. The warmth of the cup seeped pleasantly into his chilled hands as he inhaled the fragrant steam. The resort was, in every outward sense, exactly what it claimed to be: a haven of ease and refinement, contrived to soothe, flatter, and enchant. And yet beneath that polished surface he continued to sense some thread of tension, some whisper of disquiet, just perceptible under the surface harmony. As dusk deepened, tinting the snow beyond the window in shades of violet and amber, Poirot settled himself in an armchair near the fire. He had come to the Alps for rest. But his mind, never inclined to idleness, was already at work upon the impressions of the day. Dupont's strained smile, Mademoiselle Clara's vigilance, Madame Rossi's shadowed grace. The stage, though he did not yet know it, was already prepared. The players had begun to take their places. And within that tranquil retreat, amid all the frozen splendor of the mountains, a mystery was waiting to unfold, one that would soon call upon the keenest faculties of Hercule Poirot, a puzzle of human nature set against the cold magnificence of the Alps. Chapter 2. The morning broke crisp and brilliant over the Alpine resort, and the sun, striking the snowfields, laid upon them a dazzling sheen that was almost painful to the eye. Within the dining-room, however, all was warmth, polish, and cultivated ease. Hercule Poirot sat at a small corner table, taking his breakfast with that air of method and exactitude which distinguished even his simplest meal. Before him stood a soft-boiled egg in its silver cup, its shell unbroken and gleaming, toast points arranged with soldierly precision, and a pot of tisane from which steam curled upward in delicate spirals. He lifted the cup, inhaling its fragrance with approval, and allowed its warmth to combat the chill that still lingered from the night. About him, the room murmured with subdued conversation. The guests, elegant in their winter finery, spoke in low tones over porcelain and silver, producing that curious symphony of wealth which Poirot always found at once soothing and faintly insincere. His sharp green eyes moved quietly from table to table, noting expressions, attitudes, alliances, an old habit which even a prescribed holiday had not managed to cure. He had just raised his spoon to tap neatly at the shell of his egg when a sharp cry cleft the room. It was a sound so raw, so charged with distress, that every other noise ceased at once. Forks were suspended in mid-air. Voices broke off. A lady near the window gave a small gasp. Poirot set down his spoon with deliberate care, his whole attention instantly alert. A moment later the dining-room doors burst open and a young maid came stumbling through them. Her face was flushed, her breath came in ragged sobs, and for one wild instant she seemed incapable of speech. Monsieur Dupont, who had emerged from near the entrance with commendable speed, caught her by the arm. "What is this, Marie?" he demanded sharply. "Compose yourself. Speak plainly." The girl stared at him with terrified eyes. "It is Madame Rossi, monsieur. She—" She is dead." A ripple of shock ran through the room, followed at once by an agitated clamour. Several guests half rose from their chairs. One elderly gentleman exclaimed loudly in German. Elsewhere, a woman began asking confused questions in rapid Italian. Poirot was already on his feet. Dupont's face had gone ashen beneath its cultivated colour. "Mon Dieu," he muttered, and turned at once as Mademoiselle Clara appeared beside him, composed though pale. "Keep the guests calm. Send for Dr. Vogel immediately." "Of course, monsieur," she replied in her brisk, steady voice. Then, turning to the room, she raised her hands slightly. "Please, everyone, remain seated. There is no need for alarm." There was, Poirot thought, every need for alarm, but he approved the girl's presence of mind. He stepped towards Dupont. "Monsieur, if you permit, I will accompany you. In such matters a second pair of eyes may prove useful." Dupont hesitated, only for an instant, then gave a short nod. Yes, Monsieur Poirot. Your presence would be appreciated." Together they crossed the lobby and went out into the open air, where the cold struck them like a blade. The grounds lay under a mantle of fresh snow, pure and glittering in the hard light of morning. Their boots crunched sharply as they hastened towards the row of detached chalets set a little apart from the main building. Near one of these, a chalet which Poirot recognized at once as Madame Rossi's, a small knot of servants and guests had already gathered. Their faces were white with shock, and they stood uncertainly at a distance, as though instinct warned them against coming nearer. Poirot's gaze swept the scene in one swift, comprehensive glance. The chalet door stood ajar. A trail of footprints, confused and overlapping, led towards a dark shape crumpled near a drift. And there, half buried in the snow, lay Madame Elena Rossi. She had fallen on her side. Her crimson robe made a violent stain against the whiteness, while her dark hair, loosened, had spilled across the snow like ink. Her skin was terribly pale, her lips faintly blue, and her wide, glassy eyes stared upward into the pitiless Alpine light. Poirot went down on one knee beside her, heedless of the cold. With a gloved hand he brushed the snow gently from her cheek. A great artist, he thought, and now silent forever. But sentiment, with Poirot, never long delayed exactitude. Even as the thought formed, his mind was already at work, separating impressions, weighing details, noting what was present and what was absent. Dr. Vogel arrived a moment later, his medical bag clutched tightly in one hand, his breath clouding before him in the frozen air. He was a man of professional bearing, but Poirot thought his haste had in it something more than urgency. There was strain in the face and uneasiness in the eyes. The doctor knelt beside the body and made his examination with brisk efficiency. Then he rose, brushing the snow from his knees. "Hypothermia," he pronounced. "She wandered outside during the night, insufficiently clothed for such cold. A tragic accident. Nothing more." Poirot remained where he was for a moment longer, his eyes fixed upon the dead woman. "You are certain, doctor?" Vogel's jaw stiffened a little. "Quite certain, Monsieur Poirot. One has only to look. She is pale, rigid, lightly clad. The cold would have claimed her quickly." "And yet," said Poirot softly, almost to himself, "there is something here that is not as it should be." He bent closer. A little way from the body, half buried in the drift, lay a scattering of winter roses, their crimson petals vivid against the snow, their stems broken as though they had fallen or been cast aside. It was a curious detail. Flowers, brought to a woman in her chalet on a freezing night. Poirot filed it away without comment, but his interest sharpened. Near the wrist, almost hidden against the whiteness of the skin, he saw a tiny mark, a puncture so small that another man might easily have dismissed it. Poirot's eyes narrowed. At the same instant he became aware of the faintest lingering odour clinging to the folds of her robe. Bitter almonds. His pulse quickened. Not the cold, then. Poison. He straightened and looked up at Vogel. "This mark on the wrist, Doctor. What do you make of it?" Vogel bent, peered, and gave a quick, dismissive shrug. "A scratch, perhaps, or an insect bite. It is nothing." Poirot's lips moved slightly. "In my experience, Doctor, the little things are very rarely nothing." He rose and let his eyes travel over the surrounding snow. The ground was marred by footprints, many of them now fresh, made by the alarmed onlookers who had gathered after the discovery. But beneath those recent disturbances were older traces, faint and imperfectly preserved, some already half-filled by the falling snow. A clue, perhaps, or a confusion intended to become one. Behind him, Dupont hovered in a state bordering on collapse, his gloved hands twisting together in agitation. "This is a disaster," he muttered. "Madame Rossi was one of our most distinguished guests. Our pride, our attraction. If the newspapers hear of this—" "Calm yourself, monsieur," said Poirot, laying a light hand upon his arm. "Panic will not improve the matter. We must proceed with order. Tell me, when was Madame Rossi last seen alive?" "At dinner last night," said Dupont, swallowing. "She retired early. She said she was fatigued. After that, so far as I know, no one saw her." "And her chalet? Was it secure?" Dupont gave a helpless movement of the shoulders. "I cannot say. The staff possess keys, naturally, but the guests may lock their doors as they wish." Poirot nodded and turned to Mademoiselle Clara, who had by now come up quietly to the edge of the little crowd. Her face was pale, but it remained admirably composed. "Mademoiselle, did you observe anything unusual last night? Any movement near the chalets? Any person abroad?" Her eyes flickered for the briefest instant. "No, Monsieur Poirot. It was very quiet. But I did see Madame Rossi in the lounge before she retired. She was speaking with someone, a man, I think. The light was poor, and I was too far away to see him clearly." Poirot's interest sharpened. "A man? You can describe him no better?" She shook her head. "No, monsieur. I could not make him out. They seemed engaged, perhaps even in disagreement. But I heard no raised voices." "Most interesting," murmured Poirot. He turned once more to the body in the snow, and the shape of the thing began to form itself in his mind. A puncture mark, the scent of almonds, a late-night meeting in the lounge. Already the neat appearance of accident had begun to fray. This was no death by misadventure. Madame Elena Rossi had been murdered, and the hand that had killed her was almost certainly still among them, concealed behind a face of composure or concern or innocence. George, who had approached silently during these exchanges, now stood at Poirot's shoulder. Poirot did not turn, but addressed him at once. "George, my friend, you will fetch my notebook. It appears that our rest has come to an end." "As you wish, sir," said George calmly. Poirot straightened fully then and let his gaze move over the assembled faces. Shocked, curious, guarded, frightened. The splendid resort, with its golden warmth and its dazzling mountain beauty, had in a single hour become a stage for tragedy. The game had begun, and Hercule Poirot, with all the patience and precision of his famous little grey cells, would not rest until every thread of it had been drawn into the light. Chapter 3. The library of the Alpine resort offered a gracious refuge from the cold severity of the world outside. Oak-panelled walls rose to a high ceiling. Tall shelves, laden with leather-bound volumes, breathed an air of settled cultivation, and in the hearth a generous fire cast a golden living light over the room. Beyond the wide windows the snow still fell in a steady, noiseless veil, cloaking the mountains in whiteness and mystery. Poirot sat in a high-backed chair near the fire, his small, orderly person the very emblem of composure. In his gloved hands he held a cup of hot chocolate, prepared, as George had seen to it, to his exacting standards. Its rich aroma mingled agreeably with the faint scent of old paper and polished wood. Yet for all the comfort of the room, his thoughts were occupied not with repose, but with the interview that lay before him. He had sent for Mademoiselle Sophia Moretti, understudy to the late Madame Elena Rossi. Turning his head slightly, he addressed George, who stood discreetly near the door in that silent attitude of usefulness which never failed him. "My friend, you have been most prompt. Mademoiselle Moretti will come?" "She is in the lounge, sir," said George. "I gave her your message. She should be here at any moment." "Bon. We shall see what the young ambition has to say for itself." As he waited, Poirot's eyes wandered briefly towards a shelf upon which several opera scores had been arranged. Tosca, La Traviata, others besides. Silent witnesses, he thought, to the career of the woman who had that morning been found lying dead in the snow. His mind returned again to the small puncture on Madame Rossi's wrist, and to that faint but unmistakable scent of bitter almonds. Poison. And now this aria, of which Sophia Moretti had apparently spoken, a piece haunted by betrayal. It was perhaps no more than an artistic detail, yet with Poirot one detail never remained merely itself until it had been examined from every side. The door opened. Mademoiselle Clara entered first and stood aside with brisk efficiency to admit a young woman whose appearance at once justified the attention she was known to attract. Sophia Moretti was tall and slender, with dark eyes, dark hair arranged in soft waves, and a beauty that was perhaps less commanding than Madame Rossi's had been, but fresher and more immediate. She wore a gown of deep sapphire blue, elegantly cut and admirably suited to her. Yet for all her outward composure, Poirot did not fail to observe the faint tremor in her hands as she smoothed the folds of her skirt. He rose at once with a courteous inclination. "Mademoiselle Moretti, I am Hercule Poirot. I thank you for coming." She gave him a hesitant smile. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot, though I confess I am not quite certain why you wish to see me." "Pray sit," said Poirot, indicating the chair opposite his own. "It is but a small matter. A few questions only. You were, I understand, the understudy to Madame Rossi. A role of distinction, certainly." Sophia seated herself, clasping her hands tightly in her lap. "Yes, it was an honor to study beneath her. She was extraordinary." "And yet," said Poirot gently, settling back and regarding her with mild, attentive eyes, "to stand always in the shadow of such brilliance, it may at times be a little difficult, no?" A swift shadow crossed her face. "No," she said at once, then with less certainty. "That is, I suppose such a thing could happen, but I never wished her ill. She taught me a great deal." Poirot inclined his head as though entirely satisfied, though in truth he noted both the speed of the denial and the uncertainty that followed it. "Naturellement. Tell me, mademoiselle, did Madame Rossi speak often of her work? Of the aria she was rehearsing, perhaps?" Sophia hesitated. Her fingers strayed to a loose thread at her sleeve and twisted it unconsciously. She kept her preparations very private. But the lyrics, yes, I knew something of them. They were haunting. It was a tale of betrayal, I think, of a lover's treachery. "Betrayal," repeated Poirot softly. The word seemed to please him, or rather, it interested him. "And did Madame Rossi appear affected by this piece, as though its subject held for her some personal significance?" Sophia lowered her eyes. I cannot say with certainty. She was reserved. But these last few days she had seemed distracted, less self-possessed than usual. Poirot let that rest for a moment. And you saw her on the evening before her death? In the lounge, perhaps, as Mademoiselle Clara has mentioned? Sophia looked up quickly, and for the first time a definite alarm entered her expression. Yes, briefly. She was not alone? No. A man was with her? Yes. Poirot's voice remained soft, almost indolent. You can describe him? She shook her head. No, not properly. It was dark and I was not near enough. They were speaking intently. I thought, though I may be mistaken, that it might have been Monsieur Peterson, the ski instructor. There seemed some tension between them, not a quarrel exactly, but something strained. Most interesting, murmured Poirot. He folded his gloved fingertips together and regarded her for another moment. Her breathing was just perceptibly faster now. She had expected perhaps simple inquiries. She was discovering instead that each answer opened the way to another. He altered his tone very slightly. Tell me, mademoiselle, had Madame Rossi enemies? Sophia's lips parted, then closed again. Enemies? Not precisely, but she could be exacting. There were people who found her difficult. Ah, difficult people attract strong feelings. Was there anyone in particular who bore her ill will? She hesitated again. There was a critic once, a harsh man. He wrote a cruel review of one of her performances, and she never quite forgave it. Poirot's eyes sharpened. A critic? His name? I think... She frowned lightly, as though uncertain whether memory served her correctly. I think it was Herr Franz Bauer, though I may be mistaken. Merci, mademoiselle. You have a very useful memory. She coloured faintly at that, though whether from relief or discomfort it was not easy to say. Poirot rose, and she, sensing perhaps that the interview was at an end, also got to her feet. One final question, he said, in that almost casual tone, which with him frequently concealed the most pointed attention. Did you notice anything unusual in Madame Rossi's manner of late? Any sign of fear, perhaps, or distress? Sophia paused with her hand upon the door. She was quieter than usual, she said after a moment. And once I saw her reading a letter. Something in it troubled her, that was plain enough. But when I asked if anything was wrong, she said nothing. Poirot gave the slightest inclination of the head. Merci. That will be all. She slipped out of the room with evident relief, and the door closed softly behind her. For a few seconds, Poirot remained where he was, his eyes fixed upon the panels of the door as though he might still read something there. Then he turned slowly back towards the hearth, where George had resumed his silent place. A nervous young woman, George, he said thoughtfully. Ambition shines from her very plainly. But ambition, it does not always kill. Sometimes it merely trembles. George, who had long ago learned the value of listening rather than speaking too soon, waited. Poirot resumed his seat and set down the now empty chocolate cup upon the little table beside him. This aria, he murmured, a tale of betrayal. Then the letter that disturbs Madame Rossi. Then the man in the lounge. Then this critic, Herr Franz Bauer. See how the melody acquires its notes, one by one. Before George could reply, a sharp knock sounded at the door. Monsieur Dupont entered at once, his polished manner somewhat impaired by anxiety. Monsieur Poirot, forgive the interruption. The guests are growing restless. They fear for their safety. Poirot looked up with a faint, reassuring smile. Fear not, Monsieur Dupont. The truth has a habit of restoring order, even where the snow falls most delicately. You may assure your guests that Hercule Poirot is at work. Dupont's expression eased a little, though not entirely. "Merci, monsieur. Your confidence is a balm." When he had gone, Poirot rose and crossed to the glass-fronted bookcase, where his reflection looked back at him in crisp miniature. With a precise movement he adjusted his tie. Outwardly he remained a model of composure. Inwardly, however, his mind was already in swift and orderly motion. Sophia's unease had not escaped him, nor had the significance of the aria's theme, the troubling letter, or the reappearance of the same dim figure in the lounge whom Clara too had glimpsed on the previous evening. And now there was this critic, Franz Bauer, perhaps no more than a wounded vanity from Madame Rossi's past, or perhaps something more dangerous. The stage, Poirot reflected, was widening. The players were beginning one by one to reveal the outlines of their parts. He moved towards the window and stood looking out upon the snow-laden peaks, which in their majestic stillness seemed wholly indifferent to the little passions and violences of mankind. Yet within the warm and glittering walls of the resort, those passions were stirring fast enough. The death of Madame Rossi was no longer a solitary shock in the snow. It had become a composition, a dark one, gathering force measure by measure towards its climax. And Hercule Poirot, with patience, order, and the little grey cells upon which he placed such confidence, intended to hear every note of it to the end. Chapter 4. The library of the Alpine resort retained, even in the late afternoon, its atmosphere of composed dignity. The oak panelling seemed to absorb the soft crackle of the fire upon the hearth, while beyond the broad windows the snow descended in a thick and ceaseless curtain, veiling the mountains in white and pressing against the glass like a silent siege. Poirot stood near the fire, his gloved hands clasped behind his back, the warmth of the room doing little to distract him from the line of thought now engaging his whole attention. Sophia Moretti's account lingered in his mind. The critic, Franz Bauer, whose published cruelties had once wounded Madame Rossi deeply. It was perhaps only an old resentment, yet in Poirot's experience the injuries of vanity and reputation were among the most enduring known to mankind. He turned slightly towards George, who waited by the door with his customary reserve. "My friend, be so good as to ask Monsieur Dupont to arrange a meeting with Herr Bauer. I should like to speak with him at once." "At once, sir." When George had gone, Poirot cast a quick glance at his reflection in the glass-fronted bookcase and gave his tie a minute corrective adjustment. The resort's glittering surface concealed a tangle of motives, and Bauer, a man of influence in the opera world, might prove to hold one of its more troublesome threads. A few minutes later, Monsieur Dupont appeared. His polished manner remained intact, but there was now a faint sheen of perspiration upon his forehead. "Monsieur Poirot," he said in a lowered voice, "Herr Bauer is in the lounge. He is not pleased to be summoned, but he has agreed to meet you in one of the private sitting rooms nearby. I beg you, discretion, monsieur. This affair threatens the reputation of the resort." Poirot gave a faint smile. "Discretion, Monsieur Dupont, is one of my little virtues. Lead on." They crossed a corridor muffled by thick carpets and came to a small sitting room opening off the main lounge. It was a comfortable retreat, furnished with velvet chairs, polished tables, and Alpine landscapes in heavy gilt frames. A modest fire burned in the grate, lending the room a deceptive air of intimacy. Poirot seated himself, and with a courteous gesture indicated that Dupont might withdraw. A moment later the door opened, and Herr Franz Bauer entered. He was a man of imposing height and distinguished appearance. His silver hair was brushed back from a broad forehead. Wire-rimmed spectacles gave severity to a face already inclined to criticism. And his charcoal suit, impeccably tailored, suggested a mind that valued discipline and appearances in equal measure. A silk cravat softened the austerity of the whole by no more than a degree. Yet for all his polish, there was tension in him. He stood very straight, but his eyes held impatience, and something harder behind it. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, in a voice smooth but edged. "I am told you wish to speak with me. I trust it will not take long. I have work to attend to." "Indeed, Herr Bauer. I am grateful for your time. Pray sit. It is only a small matter, a few questions." Bauer hesitated, then took the chair opposite. He crossed one leg over the other with deliberate precision. His hands rested lightly on the arms of the chair, but Poirot noticed the faint twitch of one finger against the polished wood. "I cannot imagine what I can contribute," said Bauer. "I am a critic, monsieur. I am here to review a gala, not to involve myself in melodrama." Poirot's expression remained pleasantly mild. "But a critic sees much, does he not? That is his profession. He observes, he distinguishes, he weighs. Tell me, what did you make of Madame Rossi's artistry?" A faint hardening came over Bauer's features. "She had once been a remarkable talent. Latterly, I found her work less impressive. The fire of youth had diminished. A critic must speak the truth, Monsieur Poirot, even when the truth is unwelcome." "Ah, yes, the truth." Poirot inclined his head. "A noble occupation. And Madame Rossi, she did not always welcome your truths, I think." Bauer gave a slight shrug, too controlled to be natural. "She was an artist. Artists are vain. Praise intoxicates them. Criticism wounds them. It is the way of their world." Poirot leaned forward just a little, his fingertips meeting lightly. "And on the night of her death, Herr Bauer, I understand that you were writing a review, yes?" "Yes." "For an upcoming production?" "The Milan opera season." "And you remained in your room after dinner?" "I did." "Working?" "Working," said Bauer shortly. "Late into the night." Poirot let a beat of silence pass. "Might I see this review?" Bauer's eyes narrowed. "I beg your pardon?" "I have always found the labor of criticism most interesting. To distill art into words, it is a curious craft, and in this instance it may assist me in establishing the chronology of the evening." The critic's expression cooled another degree. "It is unfinished. I do not show my drafts before publication." "Naturellement," said Poirot, as though the objection were the most understandable thing in the world. "Yet perhaps your notes, then. Merely to confirm that you were occupied, as you say." Bauer's jaw tightened. For an instant it seemed he might refuse outright. Then he rose abruptly. "Very well. If you insist, come to my room. I will show you my papers." Poirot rose at once. Herr Bauer's suite reflected its occupant with striking fidelity. It was orderly to the point of severity. A writing desk stood near the window. Beside it a gleaming typewriter and a precise stack of papers. Bookshelves lined one wall, their contents chosen more for substance than display. The air held a faint mixture of tobacco and ink. Bauer crossed at once to the desk, rifled through the papers, and selected several sheets. "There," he said, extending them with a restrained impatience. "My notes." Poirot took them and scanned the pages. They were dense with neat, exact handwriting, dates, names, observations on singers who were yet to appear in Milan, all laid out with the method of a man who trusted his own judgment absolutely. It was plausible enough, perhaps entirely genuine. And then, as Bauer turned to replace another loose page, Poirot's gaze shifted. The drawer of the desk stood very slightly ajar. It was no more than a fraction of an opening, but through it he glimpsed a small vial, the pale liquid within catching the light with a faint and secretive gleam. Poirot looked up. "What is this?" Before Bauer could answer, Poirot had reached out with gloved fingers and drawn the vial partly into view. The effect upon the critic was immediate. Bauer moved with startling speed, snatching it back from Poirot's hand. "That is nothing," he said sharply. "A trifle, a curiosity from Venice, a souvenir, nothing more." Poirot's brows rose. "A curious souvenir indeed. Might I examine it?" Colour had risen in Bauer's face now. For the first time his composure had visibly cracked. "It is private, Monsieur Poirot. I must ask you to respect that." Poirot held his gaze for a long moment. Then, with a small movement of the shoulders, he relinquished the matter, at least outwardly. "As you wish. I do not press for the moment." He handed back the notes and stepped away from the desk, but his thoughts were moving quickly. A concealed vial. A critic already linked to the dead woman by old hostility. A reaction too sharp to be innocent, or perhaps merely too sharp to be comfortable. Could the little bottle contain the poison that had silenced Madame Rossi? It was possible. Yet Poirot, even in suspicion, never cared to leap before the ground had been tested. "Thank you, Herr Bauer," he said, his tone courteous once more. "You have been most obliging." Bauer said nothing. His face had resumed its mask of cold self-command, but not perfectly. Something in him remained strained. When Poirot left the room, his mind was alive with speculation. Sophia Moretti's mention of the critic had not been idle. Bauer's defensiveness, the hidden vial, the old wound between himself and Madame Rossi, all threw a dark and promising light upon him. And yet, that small inward reservation remained. Poirot had learned to trust those reservations nearly as much as his conclusions. He found Mademoiselle Clara in the lounge, where she was arranging a vase of winter roses with deft and efficient hands. "Mademoiselle," he said gently, "a word, if you please. On the night of Madame Rossi's death, did you see Herr Bauer at any hour after he had retired?" She paused only a fraction before answering. "Yes, monsieur. I saw him leave his room briefly, near midnight, I think. He appeared agitated, but he returned soon afterwards." "He carried nothing?" "Nothing that I observed, though he looked about him once or twice, as if to be certain he was not seen." "Merci, mademoiselle. You have been of the greatest assistance." She inclined her head and resumed her work. Poirot moved to the window and stood looking out at the descending snow. The peaks beyond remained grand and silent, indifferent to scandal, vanity, and death. Yet within the resort all was concealed movement, secret motives, and perilously human weakness. Herr Bauer was very certainly a suspect. The threatened exposure, the hidden vial, the late-night excursion, all these facts gathered about him into a pattern of guilt. But Poirot's instinct would not permit him to rest too comfortably in that pattern. Other threads remained. Sophia Moretti with her nervous ambition, the man seen with Madame Rossi in the lounge, the troubling letter. The resort, for all its golden warmth, concealed a stage still crowded with players whose parts had not yet been fully spoken. George approached without sound and came to rest at his master's side. "Well, sir?" Poirot did not at once turn. "We proceed with care, my friend. The puzzle grows more intricate. Monsieur Bauer presents us with very pretty reasons for suspicion, but pretty reasons are not always the truth." "Indeed, sir." Poirot gave a small, precise tug to the front of his coat. "In time," he said softly, "the pieces will arrange themselves." And with that he turned from the window, his mind already moving towards the next inquiry, while outside the snow continued to fall, quiet, relentless, and concealing much. Before we return to the story, a small word. Here on YouTube we publish 2 nocturnal tales each week. If you would like a new mystery every night, our complete library now has a home of its own. 232 full-length mysteries, all in one place, free to listen to, with no adverts and no account. You will find it at nocturnaltalespodcast.com, and the link is waiting in the description. Now, back to tonight's story. Chapter 5. The lounge of the Alpine resort glowed with all the warmth and cultivated ease that wealth could command. Firelight spilled over polished wood and deep velvet, turning the room to gold. Beyond the vast windows, however, the snow continued to fall in a soft, unending veil, blurring the jagged peaks into something almost dreamlike. Guests lingered over cognac and coffee, their voices low, their laughter just a shade too bright. The murder had not silenced the resort. It had merely altered the note in which it spoke. Poirot sat in a sheltered corner near the hearth, his small, exact person framed by the flicker of the flames. His gloved hands rested lightly upon the arms of his chair, but there was nothing idle in him. His sharp green eyes had fixed themselves upon one man alone. Luca Peterson, the ski instructor. Rumor, that faithful servant of every enclosed society, had already linked Peterson's name with that of the dead woman. There had been a quarrel, people said. Sharp words, old bitterness. Enough, at any rate, to make the young man worth examining closely. Peterson moved through the room with an ease that seemed native to him, as though he belonged as naturally to snow and mountain air as the pines themselves. He was tall and athletic, his carriage graceful, his manner outwardly relaxed. His skin held the healthy bronze of a life spent outdoors, and his smile, when he bestowed it upon the guests, was quick and winning. Yet Poirot noticed what others might not. The tension that sat across the man's shoulders, the sudden darkening of his expression whenever he believed himself unobserved. Charm, yes, but charm worn over strain. Poirot turned his head slightly towards George, who stood nearby with his usual quiet readiness. "My friend, be so good as to ask Monsieur Peterson to join me. He is near the bar, I think." "At once, sir." A minute later, Luca Peterson approached. His expression was carefully composed, though not wholly at ease. "Monsieur Poirot," he said with a guarded politeness, "you wished to speak with me?" "Yes, Monsieur Peterson. Pray sit. It is only a small matter. A few questions concerning Madame Elena Rossi." Luca took the chair opposite. He placed his hands upon his knees, but Poirot saw the fingers tighten almost at once. "I am not sure how much I can tell you," he began. "I scarcely knew her." "And yet," said Poirot softly, "you were seen disputing with her shortly before her death. There was, I think, some heat in the exchange. Will you explain it to me?" A flicker of anger crossed the younger man's face. "It was nothing," he said quickly. "A disagreement. She was difficult, demanding." Poirot regarded him with mild, unblinking attention. "I think there was more than that, Monsieur Peterson. Madame Rossi was not merely a guest to you. She belonged also to your past." Luca's expression altered. The colour seemed to leave his face all at once. Poirot continued, his tone still courteous, almost gentle. "Your expulsion from medical school, perhaps?" For a moment Luca said nothing. Then he looked up sharply. "How did you know that?" Poirot gave a small movement of the hand. "When I spoke Madame Rossi's name, your reaction was not the reaction of a man annoyed by a recent quarrel. It was older, deeper. Then, in your room, I observed a medical textbook half concealed among your manuals on ski technique. Such objects are eloquent, Monsieur Peterson. After that, it was only necessary to make one or two discreet inquiries." Luca drew a breath and let it out slowly. His shoulders sagged a little, as though some long-carried burden had at last shifted into view. "It was years ago," he said. "I was young, foolish, vain enough to think myself clever. Madame Rossi was a patron of the school. She took an interest in me. I encouraged it. I flattered her. I let her believe. He broke off, jaw tightening. I thought I could use her influence to advance myself. And when she discovered the truth, she had me expelled. The words came flatly now. She ruined everything before it had even begun. My career, my prospects, everything. I had talent, Monsieur Poirot. I might have made something of myself. Instead, he gave a bitter, helpless gesture. Instead, I rebuilt my life here. And you blamed her? Yes, said Luca with sudden raw honesty. I blamed her. She could have shown mercy. She chose instead to destroy me. Poirot studied him quietly. The bitterness was real. So too was the humiliation beneath it. One could well understand how such a wound might endure. And on the night of her death, he said, you argued with her again. Why? Luca's eyes dropped. She saw me speaking with some guests. She laughed, quietly, but enough. Said I had wasted myself. That I was a ski instructor when I might have been a doctor. She said it as if she were regretting it on my behalf. That made it worse. I lost my temper. But you did not kill her? Luca looked up at once. No, I did not. I was angry, yes, but not that. Never that. Where were you at the time of her death? In my room, asleep. You have no one to confirm it? No one. Poirot leaned back a little and tapped one gloved finger thoughtfully against the arm of his chair. For a few seconds he said nothing, and the silence was more searching than any direct accusation. Then he spoke. I am inclined to believe you, Monsieur Peterson. Luca stared at him. Relief and astonishment appeared almost together. You believe me? Yes. Poirot's voice remained calm, but it had softened. Your anger is genuine. Your wound is genuine. But it is not, I think, the anger of the murderer. It is the anger of a man who mourns what he once hoped to be. For the first time since sitting down, Luca's face lost some of its guarded tension. Thank you, he said quietly. I thought you might decide otherwise. I decide nothing lightly, said Poirot. But I ask one thing of you. You will keep this conversation to yourself. The investigation is not yet complete, and I do not wish the true culprit put upon guard. You have my word. He rose and withdrew, disappearing once more into the low golden murmur of the lounge. Poirot remained where he was for a moment, his gaze resting thoughtfully on the fire. George, who had observed the exchange in silence, moved a little nearer. A tragic history, sir, he said. Oui, said Poirot, a deep grudge, but not the final thing. He has suffered, he has resented, he has even hated, but I do not think he has killed. If not Peterson, then we are left where? Poirot's eyes lifted. With the question itself, my friend. And questions, when properly handled, are most obliging things. They lead one onward. He rose and smoothed the front of his coat with exact care. His mind had already returned to the larger pattern. The aria Madame Rossi had been rehearsing, with its theme of betrayal. The shadowed man in the lounge, Herr Bauer, with his concealed vial and his hidden fears. Dr. Vogel, too quick to pronounce upon hypothermia, and perhaps not a man at ease with his own conscience. And Sophia Moretti, beautiful, ambitious Sophia, whose poise had not been quite steady enough under questioning. As though summoned by the thought, Sophia stood at that very moment near the hearth across the room, speaking with one of the guests. Her sapphire gown caught the firelight richly, and her manner was composed to perfection. Yet Poirot remembered very well the tremor in her hands, the unease in her eyes when Madame Rossi's name had been pressed too closely upon her. Ambition in itself was not guilt. But it was very often the soil in which guilt took root. He turned his gaze to the windows, beyond which the snow still descended in soft silence. The resort's opulence was no more than a brilliant surface stretched over a web of concealed motives. Bauer's corruption, Vogel's uneasiness, Peterson's grudge, Sophia's hunger for advancement, their separate lines crossed and recrossed beneath the glittering life of the place. And through them all ran the same dark refrain, the puncture mark upon Madame Rossi's wrist, the faint scent of almonds, the swift and careful hand that had turned a murder into what was meant to seem an accident of the mountains. Poirot turned back to George. "We proceed with care," he said quietly. "The truth is near, I think. I feel it, but it still dances just beyond the reach of the hand." George inclined his head. "Very good, sir." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly, not with fatigue, but with concentration. The ski instructor's story is poignant, yes, but it is also a diversion. The true killer remains at liberty, and still wears the mask. He moved from the lounge with the quiet confidence of a man who knew that the game, though not yet won, was already entering its decisive stages. Outside, the snow continued to fall upon the mountains in flawless silence. Inside, beneath the glow of chandeliers and firelight, death had taken its place among the guests. And Hercule Poirot intended before long to strip it of all disguise. Chapter 6. The infirmary of the Alpine resort stood in curious contrast to the luxury that surrounded it. It was a room of clinical order set within a world of velvet, crystal, and polished marble. A chamber of medicines and instruments hidden inside a palace of ease. Glass-fronted cabinets lined the walls, their shelves furnished with bottles, vials, and neatly arranged apparatus that caught the firelight with a cold and restrained gleam. A small hearth burned modestly near an oak desk, strewn with medical journals, papers, and a cup of coffee gone long cold. The air held a mingled sense of antiseptic and burning logs. Poirot, stepping silently across the polished floor, thought the combination oddly fitting. A young man in a white coat, the doctor's assistant evidently, was tidying instruments in the far corner. He glanced up at Poirot's entrance, nodded nervously, and slipped out through a side door, leaving the two men alone. Dr. Vogel sat behind the desk, spectacles low upon his nose, his fingers tapping an uneven little rhythm against the wood. At the sight of Poirot, he rose at once, but not before a flicker of dismay crossed his face. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, "I had not expected to see you again so soon. To what do I owe this visit?" Poirot inclined his head. "To a small matter only, Doctor. A few details concerning the lamentable death of Madame Rossi. You will indulge me, I trust?" Vogel's smile was brief and strained. "I have already told you all that I know. Hypothermia. A tragic but simple death. There is very little more to be said." Poirot advanced a step or two into the room, his eyes taking in everything, the faint disorder among the papers, the nervous movement of the doctor's hands, and half hidden beneath one of the journals, a crumpled betting slip. "And yet," he said mildly, "certain observations continue to trouble me. The tiny mark upon the wrist, for instance. The faint scent of almonds upon the robe. These are curious notes, Doctor, in a death attributed to the cold." Vogel's jaw set. "A scratch, as I said before. And as for this scent, I think you are deceived, Monsieur Poirot. The mountains, in such weather, may play tricks even upon a sensitive man." Poirot's lips moved in a faint smile. "My senses, Doctor, are not often tricked. Nor is my reason, which has been much occupied with your patient. Tell me frankly, have you no suspicion of foul play? Or is there some cause for which you prefer so strongly the simpler explanation?" Colour rose in Vogel's face. I am a physician, monsieur, not a detective. I report what I see, facts, not fantasies. Madame Rossi died of exposure. That is all. Facts, repeated Poirot softly. Yes, but facts, as I have sometimes observed, may be arranged, emphasized, suppressed, nudged very gently in one direction or another. The doctor said nothing. Poirot moved closer to the desk. His tone remained courteous, but there was now a quiet, relentless pressure behind it. I have learned, Doctor, that you are a man under strain. Gambling debts, perhaps. A burden of that kind may make one susceptible to influence. Vogel froze. For the first time his composure visibly failed him. I do not know what nonsense you have been hearing, he stammered. My private affairs are of no concern to you. On the contrary, said Poirot, still very gently, they may be of the greatest concern. A detective, you see, listens to whispers. And in a place such as this, whispers travel rapidly. I know of a creditor, a man not famed for patience. I ask myself whether such pressure might persuade a physician to overlook certain inconvenient truths. Vogel gripped the edge of the desk. His hands now trembled openly. That is absurd. I am no puppet to be manipulated by threats. My debts are my own affair. Indeed. Then perhaps we speak instead of medicine. Poirot's eyes moved deliberately towards the cabinets. Your dispensary interests me. Unusual substances, powerful compounds, some dangerous in unskilled hands. Cyanide, for example. It is not beyond the reach of a doctor, I think. At the word, Vogel went quite pale. You cannot seriously believe that I poisoned her. Can I not? Poirot's voice did not rise. It scarcely changed at all. You declared with suspicious haste that Madame Rossi had died of hypothermia. You dismissed the puncture mark. You ignored the scent. You had access to poisons. You are a man in debt. And debt, Doctor, is one of the great corruptors. Vogel sank back into his chair as though the strength had left him all at once. She knew nothing, he said, almost under his breath. Poirot's eyes sharpened. Ah, so there is something. The doctor pressed both hands to his temples. I did not kill her, he said hoarsely. You must believe that. I did not kill her. Then tell me what you did do. For some moments there was no sound in the room save the small crackle of the hearth and the muffled pressure of snow against the windows. At last Vogel spoke. Yes, he said, I am in debt, deeply. And after Madame Rossi was found, a note was slipped beneath my door, unsigned. It knew everything, the debts, the creditors, names I had told no one. It demanded that I assist in concealing the truth. In what manner? In declaring her death an accident, in saying it was the cold, in ignoring what should have been obvious. The poison? Vogel closed his eyes. Yes. The silence that followed was brief, but heavy. Poirot straightened a little, his thoughts moving quickly. Vogel then was not the hand that struck, but a compromised witness, a frightened man used after the fact to disguise murder as misfortune. And you have no notion who sent this note? No suspicion at all? None. I told you, it was typed, anonymous. I had no way to trace it. Poirot studied him. Do not know, or do not wish to say? I do not know, Vogel repeated more firmly this time. I never saw the act. I only knew afterwards what had been done. Poirot considered him for a moment, then asked in a quieter voice, Did you see anyone near the chalet that night? Anyone at all? Vogel hesitated. Then he nodded. Yes, a figure in the snow. A man? I thought at the time it might have been, but now... He swallowed. No. A woman, I believe, slender, quick in her movement. It was dark, and I did not stay to observe. I was afraid. Poirot's pulse gave a small inward leap, though outwardly he remained as composed as ever. A woman? Yes. And you kept this to yourself? I told myself I had imagined it, or that if I had not imagined it, then it was better not to know. Better not to cross whoever was behind it. You cannot understand the fear of a man already cornered, Monsieur Poirot. Oh, but I understand fear very well, said Poirot softly. What interests me is what men choose to do because of it. He moved away from the desk then and stood for a moment before the cabinets, his hands once more clasped behind his back. The line of the case had shifted. Not cleanly, never cleanly, but enough. A frightened doctor, a coerced false diagnosis, a woman seen in the snow. Sophia Moretti's ambition returned at once to his thoughts. So too did Mademoiselle Clara's observation of a conversation in the lounge. The pattern had not yet resolved itself, but certain shapes were beginning to emerge through the storm. He turned back. Thank you, Doctor. You have brought light where you intended darkness. I advise you to speak of this to no one. The truth is not yet ready to be revealed, but it approaches. Vogel looked up, haggard and shaken. You will not expose me? Poirot regarded him steadily. Depends, Doctor, on whether you continue now to serve the truth rather than conceal it. He left the infirmary without further word. George was waiting in the corridor outside, calm as ever, a solid point of order in a world that had become increasingly untidy. A useful conversation, sir? A revealing one. Poirot began to walk slowly along the corridor, George keeping pace beside him. The doctor is compromised, but not murderous. He is in the net, yes, but he did not weave it. He confirmed the poison. He confirmed the deception. And most importantly, he saw a figure near the chalets. A woman, sir? Precisely. George was silent for a moment. That narrows matters. It narrows, and it complicates, which is often the way. They passed a tall window overlooking the white sweep of the grounds. Outside, the peaks stood in solemn majesty under the falling snow, magnificent and utterly indifferent. Within the resort, however, anxiety had begun to show itself more openly. Monsieur Dupont approached them with visible strain upon his features. Monsieur Poirot, the guests grow increasingly uneasy. Have you made progress? Patience, Monsieur Dupont, said Poirot with reassuring calm. The pieces begin to align, though the whole picture is not yet complete. Order will be restored. Dupont nodded, comforted if not wholly relieved, and withdrew. Poirot watched him go, then turned once more to George. Mademoiselle Clara may have seen more than she yet understands. And Sophia Moretti. Ah, yes. I think our mademoiselle must be questioned again. You suspect her, sir? Poirot gave one of his small, enigmatic shrugs. I suspect everybody, George. That is the first duty of intelligence. But of some persons one suspects with greater interest than of others. He gave a precise tug to the front of his coat and moved on down the corridor, his mind alive with possibilities. The resort, for all its beauty, had become a place of concealed movements and poisoned intentions, and now, somewhere within its warm and glittering walls, the truth had begun to show itself, not openly, not yet, but through cracks in the performance. The next step, Poirot knew, would be decisive, and when the moment came, Hercule Poirot would be ready. Chapter 7. The library of the Alpine resort had by evening taken on the air of a tribunal. Its oak-panelled walls and towering shelves seemed to absorb not merely the crackle of the fire upon the hearth, but the tension gathering within the room. Outside, the snow continued to fall in a dense and silent curtain, heaping itself against the windows and sealing the resort more completely within its glittering isolation. Poirot stood before the hearth, his small, immaculate figure outlined by the glow of the embers. His gloved hands were clasped behind his back. His green eyes, clear and watchful, moved from face to face with calm authority. Before him, seated in a loose semicircle of high-backed chairs, were those upon whom suspicion had most naturally fallen. Sophia Moretti sat with her hands tightly clasped, her dark head bowed just a little, though her expression was carefully schooled. Herr Franz Bauer, silver-haired and rigid, wore the severe reserve of a man determined not to betray himself. Luca Peterson sat more restlessly, one hand moving now and then upon the arm of his chair, as though he could not quite command his nerves. By the door stood George, silent and dependable as ever. The room seemed to hold its breath. Poirot let the silence endure for a moment longer, then began. "Mes amis, we are gathered here because a truth most grave has at last taken shape. Madame Elena Rossi did not perish by misfortune, nor by the caprice of the mountain cold. She was murdered." A murmur stirred the room and was as quickly stilled. "The means," Poirot continued, his voice as measured as a conductor's baton, "was a poison of unusual cunning, administered by a needle so fine that it left only the slightest puncture upon the wrist. Upon Madame Rossi's robe, as she lay in the snow, there lingered a faint scent of almonds. That delicate odor, overlooked by others, betrayed the presence of cyanide." Sophia's fingers tightened imperceptibly. Bauer shifted in his chair. Luca's face, bronzed though it was, seemed to pale. Poirot turned first towards the critic. "You, Herr Bauer, had reason enough to inspire suspicion. Madame Rossi possessed knowledge dangerous to you. She threatened, I think, to expose your corruption, your acceptance of bribes to influence your judgments. Such a scandal would have ended your reputation." Bauer's face darkened. "That is not murder," he said sharply. "It is only disgrace." Poirot gave him a small nod. "Just so. You feared her, yes. You resented her power over you. And in your room I discovered a vial hidden away with suspicious haste." Bauer's jaw tightened, which meant nothing. "At first," said Poirot, "it seemed perhaps otherwise. But I have since made the necessary inquiries. The bottle contains merely a tonic for the nerves. Very understandable, perhaps, in a gentleman of your profession." A faint flush rose under the critic's skin. "You were writing in your room that night. Your papers confirm as much. And though Mademoiselle Clara saw you leave your room briefly near midnight, you returned almost at once and bore nothing in your hands. Your fear was genuine, Herr Bauer, but it was the fear of exposure, not of blood." For the first time since the gathering began, some of the rigidity left Bauer's shoulders. "She meant to ruin me," he said in a low voice. "She had letters, dates, proof of things better left buried. I tried to silence others before. But her—" He broke off and pressed his lips together. "I did not kill her." Poirot inclined his head and turned. "And you, Monsieur Peterson?" Luca looked up at once, tense and wary. "You too had cause to resent Madame Rossi. Her influence cost you your medical career. The wound she inflicted upon your life was deep and not forgotten. You yourself admitted as much." Luca's expression hardened with remembered bitterness. "Yes," he said. "I hated what she had done to me. I hated what I became because of it. But I never killed her." "Precisely." Poirot's tone softened, though it lost none of its certainty. "Your anger is real. It bears the mark of old humiliation and of a future broken before it was formed. but anger alone is not enough. The porter saw you retire to your room well before the hour of Madame Rossi's death, ascending the stairs while another guest remained below in the lounge. There was no opportunity for you to return unseen to the chalet. You had grievance, yes, but not the means. A long breath escaped Luca, though his hands still trembled faintly. "I thought you would condemn me for it," he said. "I condemn no man without order and evidence," said Poirot. He let that settle. Then his gaze moved across the room once more. "So, Herr Bauer is not our murderer. Monsieur Peterson is not our murderer. And yet Madame Rossi was murdered. Therefore we must ask, who remains?" No one answered. Sophia Moretti sat very still. Poirot allowed the silence to stretch, almost delicately, before continuing in a lighter tone that somehow carried greater menace for being so mild. "There is, however, one more matter. Among the effects of Madame Rossi there was found a manuscript, hidden within the score of the aria she was rehearsing. A curious document. It speaks of betrayal, much like the music itself, and I think perhaps it may hold the key to her death." A tiny sound escaped Sophia, no more than the faint intake of breath one might miss in another room, but Poirot did not miss it. Her hands, clasped in her lap, tightened suddenly upon the folds of her gown. Just as quickly she disguised the movement, lowered her eyes, and gave a little cough as though the moment had been nothing. Bauer frowned in puzzled interest. Luca looked from one to the other, bewildered. Poirot saw all this, and was inwardly satisfied. The seed had been planted. He stepped back a pace. "For tonight, mes amis, that is sufficient. I bid you all good evening. The truth is now very near, and it will not elude us much longer." There was a scraping of chairs, a subdued murmur, the slight confusion of people rising with too much self-consciousness. One by one they left the library. Sophia was among the first to move, and though her manner remained controlled, Poirot observed that her composure had suffered the smallest but most telling crack. When at last the room had emptied, George came a little forward from the door. "The trap is set, sir." Poirot's eyes remained on the closed door through which Sophia had gone. "But yes, my friend." At the mention of the manuscript, Mademoiselle Moretti faltered. Only for an instant. Yet an instant is enough when one knows where to look. She believes there exists some written accusation hidden among Madame Rossi's effects, and that belief will work upon her. "The manuscript itself?" Poirot turned then, and a faint gleam of satisfaction lit his face. "A fiction. A letter composed by me suggesting that Madame Rossi had begun to suspect the jealousy of her understudy. I placed it among the score and allowed its existence to be mentioned only in that room." George permitted himself the slightest shift of expression. "Then, if she acts, she condemns herself." Poirot moved to the window and looked out into the night, where the snow-laden peaks stood immense and silent beneath the dark. The aria Madame Rossi had rehearsed, its tale of betrayal, had proved a singularly appropriate accompaniment to the case. What had begun as a note of atmosphere had become, in the end, a clue of character. Ambition had heard in it a warning, and answered with fear. "The final act approaches, George," said Poirot softly. "And when Mademoiselle Moretti makes her move, as I think she must, we shall be ready." Outside, the snow continued its patient descent over the mountains. Inside, in the warm hush of the library, the last movement of the drama had been prepared. And Hercule Poirot, with the calm assurance of a master who has arranged every note of his composition, waited for the curtain to rise. Chapter 8. The library of the Alpine resort lay under a hush so complete that even the crackle of the fire seemed subdued by it. Oak-panelled walls, shelves of dark leather-bound books, and the wide windows beyond which snow pressed in a white and silent mass, all combined to give the room the solemnity of a private court. It was a fitting place, thought Poirot, for the last act of the drama. He stood before the hearth, neat, composed, and immaculate as ever, his gloved hands clasped behind his back. The glow of the embers struck a faint warmth upon his face, but his eyes were cool and watchful as they moved over those assembled before him. Sophia Moretti sat very straight, though her dark eyes were restless. Herr Franz Bauer, silver-haired and severe, held himself with rigid dignity. Luca Peterson leaned forward a little, hands clasped, his expression troubled. Dr. Vogel sat apart, spectacles low on his nose, his face haggard and uneasy. Monsieur Dupont, though still elegantly dressed, had lost all ease of manner. Anxiety had worn plainly through the polish. Near the bookshelves stood Mademoiselle Clara, alert and silent. George, as always, remained by the door, quiet and dependable. Poirot let the silence endure for a moment longer. Then he spoke. "Mes amis, we are gathered here to unmask a murderer, a person whose ambition became a poison long before poison itself touched the hand." A stir passed through the room. Sophia's fingers tightened upon the fabric of her gown. Bauer's jaw set. Luca glanced sharply from one face to another. Poirot raised one gloved hand, and the room became still again. "At our last meeting," he said, "I showed that neither Herr Bauer nor Monsieur Peterson could be the killer. Herr Bauer had indeed much to fear from Madame Rossi. She possessed knowledge that threatened to expose his corruption, and the letter she was seen reading on the evening of her death was, in fact, from Bauer himself. A warning, couched in the most careful language, urging her not to make public what she knew. It was the letter of a frightened man, not a murderous one. Yet the vial in his possession was no poison, only a tonic for the nerves, and the work upon his review, combined with the observations of Mademoiselle Clara, confirmed that, though agitated, he was not the hand that struck. Bauer inclined his head stiffly. Relief and humiliation strangely mingled in his expression. Poirot turned to Luca. And Monsieur Peterson, though he had suffered deeply through Madame Rossi's influence, had neither the opportunity nor, I think, the true nature of the murderer. His resentment was real, yes, but it was the resentment of a wounded man, not the cold precision of the assassin. The man seen speaking with Madame Rossi in the lounge that evening was indeed Monsieur Peterson. Their quarrel I have already accounted for, and it has no bearing upon the crime." Luca let out a quiet breath, but said nothing. Poirot's gaze moved then, and came to rest upon Sophia Moretti. "Mademoiselle," he said softly, "the same cannot be said of you." Her face drained of colour. "I do not understand you, Monsieur Poirot." "Oh, yes," said Poirot, and his voice, though still gentle, had in it now an unyielding force. "You understand very well." He took a few measured steps forward, never once removing his eyes from hers. "You had the motive. Madame Rossi stood before you as the one obstacle you could neither surpass nor escape. So long as she lived, you remained the understudy, the talented shadow, the woman who waited while another received the light. You told me yourself of the aria she rehearsed, a tale of betrayal. But it was you, mademoiselle, who gave that theme its most terrible expression." Sophia's lips parted, but no words came. Poirot continued. "You visited Dr. Vogel's infirmary the day before Madame Rossi's death. This fact has been confirmed by the doctor's assistant. You claim to require a sedative for your nerves. A plausible request. A useful pretext." Dr. Vogel made a stricken movement in his chair. "I did not know," he muttered hoarsely. "She came to the infirmary. My assistant saw her sign the ledger. She said it was for sleep." Poirot turned his head only slightly. Yes, Doctor. You were afraid. Afraid because another had already used your debts against you. Afraid because weakness had made you available to pressure. Poirot paused. And how did Mademoiselle Moretti come to know of those debts? Because when she visited the infirmary for her so-called sedative, she observed on your desk the betting slips you had been too careless to conceal. She understood at once your vulnerability, and she used it without mercy. But fear does not erase fact. Poison left your infirmary, and it passed into the hands of Mademoiselle Moretti. Vogel bowed his head. Poirot returned his attention to Sophia. You acquired a rare toxin, one that would leave the body cold still, and deceptively suited to the appearance of death by exposure. And you secured, after the act, the doctor's frightened cooperation in allowing the false diagnosis of hypothermia to stand. That is not true, Sophia whispered. Poirot gave the slightest shrug. Then let us continue. On the night of the murder you sent Madame Rossi a note expressing your wish to speak with her privately about the aria she had been rehearsing. You suggested the garden terrace, away from the ears of the hotel. A quiet place, a cold place, a place where a body found in the snow might be mistaken for a woman who had wandered out and succumbed to the cold. Madame Rossi, who had no reason to suspect her understudy's true feelings, accepted. And there, upon the terrace, you presented her with a bouquet of winter roses, a gesture of deference, of admiration, of kindness, perhaps. Yet within those roses was concealed the true weapon, a fine needle, laced with poison, hidden among the thorns. A single prick to the wrist, delivered in a moment so slight that it could scarcely be felt, and Madame Rossi collapsed upon the terrace in the snow where you left her to be found. Sophia made a strangled sound. No. Yes. Poirot's voice cut across hers, still controlled, still quiet, and therefore all the more devastating. When Madame Rossi was found, I saw upon her wrist the tiny puncture. Upon her robe there lingered the faint scent of almonds. Near the body, roses had been discarded, innocent to the eye, but far less innocent to the little grey cells of Hercule Poirot. Dr. Vogel spoke of a slender female figure seen near the chalets, and your visit to the infirmary established your means. Sophia's hands had closed now into fists. This is madness. You have no proof. Poirot's expression did not change. On the contrary, I have a great deal. The assistant places you in the infirmary. The doctor confirms the coercion that followed. The figure in the snow corresponds to your form. The puncture, the scent, the flowers, all point in the same direction. Each by itself, perhaps, would be insufficient for a fool. Together, they are more than enough for Poirot. She half rose, then sank back again, breathing hard. Poirot took one final step forward. And there is also the manuscript. At that word her expression altered utterly. The letter I mentioned, the one suggesting that Madame Rossi had begun to suspect your jealousy, never existed outside my own invention. It was a trap, mademoiselle. And when I named it, you betrayed yourself. Your fear leapt before your caution. You believed some written accusation remained hidden among her belongings, and that belief touched you because it corresponded with the truth. Sophia stared at him, all pretense broken now. For a long moment she said nothing. Then the last of her composure collapsed. I only wanted my chance, she said, and her voice came in a broken rush. She had everything, fame, adoration, the stage itself. I stood behind her always, waiting while she took it all. I thought... She covered her face with her hands. I thought that if she were gone, it would at last be my turn. No one spoke. The only sound was the small, terrible sound of her weeping. Poirot looked at her, and there was no triumph in his face, only that grave sadness which came to him when vanity, weakness, and desire had run their course to murder. "Ambition," he said quietly, "when it is not governed, becomes a poison more deadly than any carried in a vial." Sophia lowered her hands, her face wet with tears, and bowed her head. Monsieur Dupont drew a long, shaken breath and stepped forward. "Then it is finished," he said. "The nightmare is over." "Yes," said Poirot. "It is over. The snow may conceal many things, monsieur, but not forever." The tension in the room slowly loosened. Bauer sat back as though a cord had been cut within him. Luca looked at Sophia with something like pity, though he could not wholly conceal his horror. Dr. Vogel remained bent over, diminished by relief and shame alike. Even Clara, so self-controlled, seemed at last to permit herself the smallest release of breath. Poirot turned towards the window. Outside, the peaks stood in their vast and silent majesty, untouched in appearance by the passions that had played themselves out below. The snow still fell, serene and indifferent. Within those golden walls, however, order had been restored. The mask had been removed. The false music of deception had given way at last to the final note of truth. George came quietly to his side. "The curtain falls, sir." Poirot gave the faintest adjustment to one immaculate moustache. "Yes, my friend. And we may hope that when ambition next seeks the stage, it chooses a kinder part." He remained for a moment looking out into the Alpine night, while behind him the gathered company began slowly to disperse, the great strain of the mystery finally broken. Thus ended the tragedy of Madame Elena Rossi, a death wrought not by the cruelty of the mountain cold, but by envy sharpened into calculation. The puncture upon the wrist, the bitter scent of almonds, the poisoned roses, the frightened doctor, the understudy's fatal longing for the spotlight, each had formed part of the deadly composition. And only Hercule Poirot, with his patient precision and his infallible little grey cells, had heard the whole dark melody through to its close. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of the Alpine Snowbound secrets. The mountain killed no one. Madame Rossi died of envy, sharpened into calculation, a puncture upon the wrist, the bitter scent of almonds and a bouquet of roses that carried rather more than a compliment. The hand behind it was Mademoiselle Moretti. Not a stranger, not an intruder from outside, but the understudy, the talented shadow who waited in the wings while another stood in the light. As Poirot puts it to her, so long as Madame Rossi lived, she remained the woman who waited. The aria of betrayal that she spoke of so admiringly was, in the end, her own composition. And the others were guilty of smaller, more human things. Monsieur Peterson had been wounded deeply and quarreled bitterly, but resentment is not the cold precision of an assassin. The doctor was not wicked, merely weak, a man in debt, and therefore a man available to pressure. That is the quiet cruelty of the story. The murderer's real talent was not for poison at all, but for finding the exact place where each person around her had already been broken. What lingers is the last exchange. George says the curtain falls. Poirot answers that we may hope, when ambition next seeks the stage, it chooses a kinder part. Outside, the peaks stand in their vast and silent majesty, entirely indifferent to everything that has happened beneath them. If this mystery stayed with you, tell us in the comments the moment you began to suspect the understudy, and whether you think the doctor deserved more sympathy than he received. If you want the next case early and without a single interruption, that is Patreon. $2.99 a month brings you every episode ad-free and ahead of everywhere else, and it is the most useful thing you can do for this show. The link is the first one in the description. And we now have a home of our own. Every story we have ever made lives at nocturnaltalespodcast.com. More than 230 full-length mysteries, free, with no paywall, no account, and no password to remember. Each new case appears there 2 weeks after it reaches Patreon and Spotify, so nothing is ever lost. That is nocturnaltalespodcast.com. Keeping all of it free does cost money. If these stories have become part of your evening and you would like to help pay for the next one, there is a support page on that same site. $3, $5, or $10 a month, or whatever you like, just once. No story is ever locked behind it. That is rather the point. And a word of thanks to the listeners who supported us directly on the website this week: Shari, Tammy, Steph, and Amarkle. You have paid for the next story, and we are grateful to you. For now, thank you again for staying with us to the last line. Until the next case, be wary of the person who applauds most warmly from the wings.